don't even know where to start. I'm writing this from a cheap hotel room while my phone keeps buzzing with calls from numbers I don't recognize. I'm scared. I haven't slept in 36 hours. Every shadow feels like it's watching me. If something happens to me, let this be a warning. Never mess with the dark web. And for the love of God, don't betray your best friend. It started like any other stupid night. My buddy, Matt, and I were hanging out in my tiny apartment, talking about random conspiracy theories we found online. Matt was always the smart one, the grounded one. If I had a crazy idea, he'd usually talk me out of it. But this time, it was different. I was scrolling through Reddit when I stumbled on a thread about the dark web. You know the kind, the ones with people bragging about buying weird stuff, hiring hackers, or accessing red rooms. I read one post about a chat room that was supposedly a gateway to custom requests, and it piqued my interest. Stupid, I know. But after a couple of beers, my judgment went out the window. Ever been on the dark web? I asked Matt, half joking, but also kind of hoping he'd say yes. He shook his head and laughed. Nah, man, that's a rabbit hole I don't want to go down. It's all scams and feds anyway. That should have been the end of it. But something about the idea of it, the mystery, the danger, grabbed hold of me. After Matt left that night, I downloaded Tor and started exploring. At first, it was just curiosity. I wanted to see if it was all hype, but then I found it. The chat room from the Reddit thread. It was called Black Exchange, and it wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. The interface was bare bones, just a black screen with a box for typing and a list of usernames. The messages were chilling. People were asking for things like counterfeit passports, illegal substances, and, most disturbingly, personal information about other people. One user had posted something that made my stomach turn. Looking for info on a co-worker, will pay $3. Someone replied almost immediately with a full name, address, and workplace details. I don't know what came over me, but I kept reading. People were bidding money for all kinds of dirt, credit card numbers, blackmail material, you name it. It was like watching a car crash. I couldn't look away. The real turning point happened about a week later. Matt and I had a falling out over something stupid. I don't even remember what it was. We'd been drinking again and he called me out on some bad decisions I'd made. It hit a nerve. I felt humiliated. I didn't realize how much resentment I'd been holding against him until that moment. I got drunker after he left, spiraling in self-pity. That's when the idea hit me. I was still lurking on Black Exchange, and in my messed up, angry state, I thought it would be funny to post something about Matt. Not anything serious, just as a joke, or at least that's what I told myself. I typed out his name, his phone number, and some details about where he worked. I even uploaded a picture of him from my phone. I wrote something stupid like, "Looking for info on this guy, annoying as hell, will pay for dirt." It was a joke, or maybe it wasn't. At that point, I didn't even know what I was doing. The response was immediate. Within minutes, people started messaging me. At first, it was just weird comments. "What do you need him for?" Or, "I can get you anything you want." But then someone sent me a DM. "I'll take care of it for $500. Send PayPal." That's when I realized I'd crossed a line. I panicked and tried to delete the post, but there was no option to delete anything. The chat room didn't work like that. Once it was posted, it was out there forever. I closed the browser and shut my laptop, telling myself it was no big deal. No one would actually do anything, right? The next morning, I woke up to a missed call from Matt's mom. She left a voicemail, her voice shaking. "Have you seen Matt? He didn't come home last night." My stomach dropped. I called her back, trying to sound calm. "No, I haven't seen him since yesterday. Maybe he crashed at someone's place." Her voice broke. He always texts me if he's staying somewhere. This isn't like him. I hung up and tried calling Matt, but his phone went straight to voicemail. By noon, I was pacing my apartment, freaking out. Matt wasn't the type to just disappear. Something was wrong. By the time the cops showed up at my door, I was barely holding it together. They were polite, but firm, asking if I knew anything about Matt's whereabouts. Apparently, someone had reported seeing a man matching Matt's description getting into a black van outside his apartment the night before. The footage was grainy, but it was enough to raise red flags. I lied, of course. I said I had no idea where he was, but inside I was dying. I couldn't stop thinking about the post. Had someone from that chat room actually done something to him? I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but deep down I knew better. Then the detective said something that made my blood run cold. We got an anonymous tip suggesting you might know more about Matt's disappearance than you're letting on. I froze. Someone from Black Exchange had turned on me. I swear I almost passed out when the detective said that. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears, and I knew I had to think fast. What? Me? No way, I stammered, trying to sound as confused as possible. Matt's my best friend. I've got nothing to do with this. The detective gave me this long, hard look, like he was trying to see through me. Then he nodded. All right, he said, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe me. We'll be in touch. When they left, I slammed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. My first thought was to check my laptop. I booted it up and went straight to the Black Exchange chat room. The post about Matt was still there, and the thread had blown up overnight. There were dozens of replies now, some with cryptic comments, others offering services. But one reply stood out, sent around 3 a.m. Job's done. You're next. I couldn't breathe. My head was spinning, and I felt like I was going to throw up. My paranoia was in overdrive. I started pacing around the apartment, peeking out the blinds every few minutes to make sure no one was outside. My brain was racing with questions. Who the hell had posted that? Did they really mean Matt was gone? And what did they mean by "you're next"? I knew I had to do something, but I had no idea where to start. Calling the cops was out of the question. I couldn't exactly explain why I was poking around a dark web chat room. And even if I could, I doubted they'd believe me. I was on my own. That night was the worst of my life. I barely slept, jumping at every little noise. At one point, I thought I heard someone trying the door handle, but when I checked, no one was there. I was losing it. I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something was very, very wrong. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text. The number was unlisted, and the message was just one word: run. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Was this some sick joke, or was it a warning? I didn't want to wait around to find out. I grabbed my laptop and threw it in my bag, along with whatever clothes I could fit. I didn't have a plan. I just knew I had to get the hell out of there. I drove for hours, not even sure where I was going. I ended up at a rundown motel off the highway, paid cash for a room, and locked myself in. The place was disgusting. Stains on the walls, a musty smell that made me gag. But I didn't care. I just needed somewhere to hide. Once I was settled, I opened my laptop to check the chat room again. It felt like the only way to get answers, even though I was terrified of what I might find. The thread about Matt had grown even more. Someone had posted a blurry photo of what looked like a warehouse or a basement with a caption that made my blood run cold. Safe delivery! Client! Confirm receipt. There was no mistaking it. The person in the photo was Matt. He was tied to a chair, his head slumped forward. His shirt was ripped, and there were dark stains, blood, on the floor beneath him. I felt like I was going to faint. This was real. Someone had taken him, because of me. I sat there, staring at the screen, trying to make sense of it all. Why had they taken Matt? Was it just a coincidence that I'd posted about him? Or had my stupid post somehow put a target on his back? The guilt was crushing, but there was something else too, fear. If they'd taken Matt, what was stopping them from coming after me? That's when I noticed something else in the chat room. A new thread had been started by someone with a username I didn't recognize. The title was simple: Client failed to pay. Next target acquired. The thread was about me. The first post was chillingly detailed. My full name, my address, even a photo of my apartment building, all laid out for anyone to see. The replies were worse. People were already bidding, offering obscene amounts of money for God knows what. Some of the messages were vague, others explicit. How slow do you want it? Any preferences for disposal? I slammed the laptop shut, my chest heaving. This couldn't be happening. I was nobody, just some idiot who'd made a stupid mistake. Why were they targeting me? Was this some kind of game to them? I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no way out. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I woke up to the sound of someone pounding on the door. My heart stopped. For a second, I thought it was them, the people from the chat room, come to finish the job. But when I peeked through the peephole, it was worse. It was the cops. They burst in before I could even think about running. I didn't even have time to explain before they slapped the cuffs on me and started reading me my rights. My neighbors were watching from their doors, whispering to each other as I was hauled outside like some kind of criminal. "What the hell is going on?" I yelled, struggling against the officers. "I didn't do anything." The detective from the day before stepped forward, his face grim. "We found your fingerprints at Matt's apartment," he said, "and your laptop was flagged in connection to some very disturbing activity online. You're coming with us." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My fingerprints? My laptop? None of it made sense. But as they shoved me into the back of the squad car, I realized the truth. Someone from the chat room had set me up. And now I was their scapegoat. The ride to the station was surreal. I couldn't stop shaking, but it wasn't just fear, it was rage. I kept replaying everything in my head: the chat room, the post about Matt, the photo of him in that disgusting basement. And now the cops thought I was involved. The whole thing felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. When we got to the station, they shoved me into an interrogation room. The walls were this gross shade of yellow, and the fluorescent lights made my head pound. I sat there, staring at the one-way mirror, wondering how I was going to explain any of this. I didn't even know where to start. What was I supposed to say? "Oh, by the way, I accidentally got my best friend kidnapped by posting his info on the dark web as a joke." Yeah, that'd go over great. After what felt like hours, the detective came in. He had a folder in his hand and this smug look on his face, like he already knew I was guilty. He sat down across from me, opened the folder, and slid a photo across the table. It was the same photo from the chat room. Matt, tied to the chair, blood pooling beneath him. My stomach twisted so hard I thought I was going to throw up. "Where did you get this?" I blurted out before I could stop myself. The detective raised an eyebrow. "Funny, I was going to ask you the same thing." I don't know," I stammered, my voice cracking. "I swear I don't know anything about this." He leaned back in his chair, studying me like a bug under a microscope. "Your laptop says otherwise," he said. "We traced your IP address to a dark website called Black Exchange. Recognize the name?" My heart sank. They had my laptop. They'd seen everything. There was no way out of this. "It's not what you think," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "Then explain it," he said, his tone sharp. Because right now, all we see is a man who posted his best friend's personal information online and then had the audacity to bid on his own disappearance. Wait, what? I froze, the blood draining from my face. I didn't bid on anything. The detective's eyes narrowed. That's not what the logs say. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Someone had used my account to bid on Matt's kidnapping. The amounts were insane, thousands of dollars I didn't even have. But the timestamps didn't lie. According to the logs, the bids had been placed in the early hours of the morning, right around the time I'd gotten that text that said, "Run." It was like they were toying with me, pulling strings behind the scenes to make sure I took the fall. And it was working. The evidence was piling up, and I had no way to prove I wasn't involved. Every explanation I tried to come up with sounded like a pathetic excuse. The detective leaned forward, his voice low and menacing. "We know Matt's in danger. If you don't start talking, his blood is on your hands." I broke. I told them everything about the chat room, the post, the messages. I even admitted that I'd uploaded Matt's photo, though I swore up and down it was meant as a stupid prank. The detective didn't look impressed. If anything, he looked even more pissed. "You expect me to believe this was all some harmless joke?" he snapped. "Do you have any idea what kind of people use these sites? This isn't a game." "I know that now," I yelled, my voice cracking. I didn't know they'd actually do anything. Please, you have to believe me. Someone set me up." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he pulled another photo from the folder and slid it across the table. This one was even worse than the first. It was Matt again, but this time he was awake, staring straight at the camera. His face was swollen, his eyes bloodshot. There was a deep gash on his forehead, and his mouth was taped shut. Behind him, I could make out the same dimly lit basement from the first photo. The caption scrawled across the bottom made my blood run cold. 24 hours left. I lost it. I started sobbing, begging the detective to believe me, to do something, to find Matt before it was too late. But he just sat there watching me like I was some kind of animal. When I finally calmed down, he stood up and walked to the door. "You've got one chance to make this right," he said. "Think long and hard about what you're not telling us." And then he left, leaving me alone with the photos. The next few hours were a blur. They didn't put me in a cell, but they made it clear I wasn't free to leave. They wanted me to stew in my guilt, to break down and confess to something I hadn't done. I kept telling myself there had to be a way out of this, a way to prove I wasn't behind it. But every time I thought about the chat room, about the messages, my mind went blank. By the time night fell, I was running on pure adrenaline. My hands were cuffed to the table, but my mind was racing. I had to figure out who was behind this. Someone on that site had it out for me, and they were playing a game I didn't understand. And then it hit me. The text, the one that said "run." Whoever had sent it knew what was happening before the cops showed up. They weren't just some random bidder, they were watching me. But how? The answer came almost immediately, and it made my skin crawl. My laptop, the same one the cops had confiscated. If they could access it, so could someone else. What if they'd been tracking me this whole time, watching every move I made? The thought made me feel sick.
I needed to get out of there. I didn't care about the consequences anymore. I just wanted to survive. But as I sat there, chained to the table, I realized the horrifying truth. The people who had taken Matt weren't done with me. And if I didn't figure out their endgame soon, I was going to end up just like him. After hours of sitting in that cold, silent room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, I started to lose track of time. Every second felt like a year. The photos of Matt, the blood, the basement, His swollen, terrified face kept flashing in my mind like a broken slideshow. The image of the gash on his head burned into my brain, making my stomach churn every time I blinked. I kept replaying the detective's words. 24 hours left. Was that a bluff to scare me? Or was it real? Every instinct screamed that it wasn't just a sick joke. Whoever these people were, they weren't messing around. At some point, I heard the faint sound of footsteps outside the door. I sat up straight, my body tense. Was it the detective, more cops, or someone else? The door creaked open and a different officer walked in, someone I hadn't seen before. He was younger, clean-shaven, but his eyes had this cold, dead look that instantly put me on edge.
He placed a water bottle on the table and slid it toward me without a word. Then he sat down, folding his hands in front of him like this was some kind of casual conversation. "We traced your online activity back further," he said, his voice calm and measured. Too calm. "Seems like this wasn't your first visit to the dark web. You've been poking around for a while. Care to explain?" I froze. How did they know that? I'd used a VPN, taken precautions, not perfect ones, but enough to keep me anonymous, or so I thought. I was just curious," I stammered. "It's not illegal to look, is it?" He raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a slight smirk. "Not illegal, no, but when people start disappearing, it raises questions." "I didn't do anything." My voice cracked, and I hated how pathetic I sounded. "You have to believe me. Someone's setting me up." He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. "Then help us understand. Why would someone want to frame you?" That question hit harder than I expected. Why me? I wasn't anyone special, just a guy with a crappy job, no money, and a tendency to make bad decisions. But the more I thought about it, the more something didn't sit right. This wasn't random. Someone had planned this, orchestrated it, and I was their target. And then it hit me, the chat room. There had been one user who kept replying to my post about Matt, someone who seemed unusually interested. Their username was something generic, Watcher42, but their messages stood out. They'd been the first to offer services and had even asked me for specific details about Matt. At the time, I'd brushed it off as just another creep in a sea of creeps. But now it felt personal. "Does the name Watcher42 mean anything to you?" I asked, my voice shaking. The officer's smirk vanished, his expression darkened, and for a second I thought I saw something like recognition in his eyes. He didn't answer right away, but when he did, his tone had shifted. "Where did you hear that name?" I saw it in the chat room," I stammered. "They're the ones who—" Before I could finish, the officer stood up abruptly. He grabbed the folder, tucked it under his arm, and headed for the door. "Stay here," he said coldly, not even looking back. The door slammed shut, leaving me alone again. But his reaction told me everything I needed to know. Watcher42 wasn't just some random troll. They were connected to this, maybe even running the whole thing. I started to panic. The cops weren't going to save Matt. Hell, they weren't even going to save me. If they knew about Watcher42, then this was way bigger than some dumb post on a dark web forum. These people had reach, real power, and they were pulling the strings from the shadows. I had to act fast. My hands were still cuffed to the table, but I noticed something they'd overlooked. My phone. It was in a clear evidence bag, sitting on the edge of the table, just barely within reach. I stretched my fingers as far as I could, straining against the cuffs, and managed to knock it closer with the tips of my fingers. My heart raced as I fumbled with the bag, tearing it open with my teeth. I unlocked the phone and went straight to my messages. The last text, the one that said "run," was still there. I stared at it, trying to figure out what to do. Could I text back? Would they even respond? It was a risk, but I didn't have a choice. I typed a single word, "Why?" The response came almost instantly. Too late to ask questions. My breath caught in my throat. Whoever this was, they were watching me right now. I typed again, my fingers trembling. "What do you want?" The reply made my blood run cold. "Redemption. See you soon." I dropped the phone, my chest heaving. Redemption? What the hell did that mean? Before I could process it, the door burst open and 2 officers stormed in. They grabbed me without a word, yanking me to my feet and dragging me down the hallway. I tried to resist, but it was no use. They were bigger, stronger, and they weren't listening to a word I said. They threw me into a holding cell, slamming the door behind me. The room was tiny, with a single cot and a flickering overhead light. I collapsed onto the cot, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed that I was running out of time, not just for Matt, but for myself. As I sat there, staring at the cracked concrete walls, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then it got louder. It was coming from the vent above the cot. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding, and peered into the darkness. That's when I saw it. A camera. Tiny, barely visible, but definitely there. And next to it, scratched into the metal, were 2 words. Tick-tock. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, shaking uncontrollably. They were in here, in the station, watching my every move. I wasn't safe anywhere. And then the realization hit me like a freight train. Matt wasn't their only target. This whole thing was never just about him. It was about me. The tapping in the vent didn't stop. It was rhythmic, taunting, like a metronome, counting down to something horrible. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, but the camera glinted every time the flickering light overhead caught it just right. I was trapped. Every move I made, every thought, every breath, they were watching. I slumped back onto the cot, staring at the scratched words next to the camera. Tick-tock. Time. They were obsessed with it. The photos of Matt, the countdown, the way everything felt orchestrated, like a sick, twisted game. They wanted me to know I was running out of time, and they wanted me to know there was nothing I could do to stop it. Hours passed, maybe more. The light in the cell never changed, and no one came to check on me. I kept waiting for the detective, the smug officer, anyone, but it was just me and the camera. My stomach churned with hunger, but fear kept me from caring. My head pounded from the fluorescent buzz above me, and my fingers were raw from scratching at the cot in frustration. I needed answers. I needed a way out. And then my phone buzzed. At first, I thought I was imagining it. My phone should have been confiscated, but when I looked down, there it was, lying on the floor next to the cot. No bag, no handcuffs, just the phone glowing faintly in the dim light. Someone had put it there. The notification was from an unknown number, just like before. I unlocked the phone, and my heart sank as I read the message. "Look behind you." I froze. My entire body tensed as cold dread washed over me. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to see what was there. But the feeling was overwhelming, like something was breathing down my neck. Slowly, I turned my head. Nothing. Just the empty cell, the concrete walls, the flickering light. But then I noticed something I hadn't before. A piece of paper had been slipped under the door, almost invisible against the dirty floor. I crawled toward it, my hands trembling, and picked it up. It wasn't paper. It was a photo. Matthew. He was still tied to the chair, but he looked worse now. His face was pale, his eyes half closed, blood stained his shirt, and there were deep, purple bruises on his arms. But what really got me was the background.
The dingy basement had been replaced by a sterile white room with bright lights and clean tiles, like a morgue or an operating room. Scrawled across the photo in what looked like blood was a single word: next. I couldn't take it anymore. I started screaming, pounding on the door until my fists were raw. I begged for someone, anyone, to come and let me out. But no one came. The camera in the vent kept watching, the scratches next to it mocking me. Tick-tock! I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, when my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a video. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me didn't want to see it, but I had no choice. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone as I pressed play. The video was short, maybe 15 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. It started with a close-up of Matt's face. He was crying, his mouth moving under the duct tape as he tried to scream. The camera panned out slowly, showing his body strapped to a metal table. His arms and legs were secured with heavy straps, and his fingers twitched weakly like he was trying to fight, but didn't have the strength. Then the camera shifted. A figure stepped into frame, dressed in a surgical gown and gloves. Their face was covered by a plain, white mask, featureless like a mannequin. In their hand was a scalpel. The figure raised the scalpel, hovering it above Matt's chest, and then the screen went black. The last frame lingered on my phone, a new caption written in blood-red text: "You're next." I dropped the phone, my body shaking violently. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind was a swirling mess of fear and guilt and anger. They were toying with me, dragging this out for their own sick pleasure. And I was letting them. Number, not anymore. I stood up, my legs barely holding me, and started pacing the cell. There had to be a way out. Something I was missing. My eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that could help me escape. That's when I noticed it. The vent. It was small, barely big enough for my arm, but it was loose. I climbed onto the cot and started yanking at the metal grate, ignoring the camera as it followed my movements. My fingers bled as I pried it off, but I didn't care. I reached inside, feeling around for anything I could use. My fingers brushed against something cold and sharp. A blade. Someone had left it there for me.
I didn't have time to think about who or why. I gripped the blade tightly and started working on the screws of the cell door. It was slow, agonizing work, but adrenaline kept me going. After what felt like hours, the lock finally gave way. I pushed the door open cautiously, peeking into the empty hallway. It was quiet, too quiet. I stepped out, clutching the blade like a lifeline, and started moving. The fluorescent lights above me flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. Every step echoed like a gunshot. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get out. As I rounded a corner, I heard it, faint, muffled cries. My heart raced as I followed the sound, my feet moving faster and faster until I reached a heavy steel door. My hands trembled as I pushed it open. Inside was a room straight out of my nightmares, bright, sterile lights, cold metal tables, bloodstains on the floor. And in the center of it all was Matt, strapped down just like in the video. His head turned weakly toward me, his eyes wide with terror. "Matt!" I ran to him, fumbling with the straps. "I'm getting you out of here, just hold on." But before I could free him, I heard the door slam shut behind me. I turned, and my blood froze. The masked figure stood there, holding a scalpel. Behind them, more figures appeared, their faces hidden behind identical white masks. They moved slowly, deliberately, closing in from all sides. I screamed, lunging at them with the blade, but it was no use. They were too many, too strong. They swarmed me, dragging me to the floor as I thrashed and fought. The last thing I saw before they covered my face was Matt, tears streaming down his cheeks as he mouthed 2 words through the duct tape. "I'm sorry." I don't know how long it's been since then. Days? Weeks? All I know is that I'm back in a cell, but it's not the same one. This one is darker, colder. The camera is still there, watching. The words scratched into the wall this time are different. Game over. I don't know what they'll do to me. Maybe they'll kill me. Maybe they'll keep me here forever. But one thing is clear. There's no escape.